In this video, we will discuss Indigenous religious traditions. When we talk about Indigenous religious traditions, in this course we're going to talk about both Indigenous North American Native religious traditions and Indigenous African religious traditions. We want to start out by making a distinction between the words indigenous and primitive. You might hear when some people, sometimes even scholars, typically in the 18 and 1900s, talk about indigenous traditions, they use the word primitive to describe them. We want to make sure to avoid this. Primitive typically has a negative connotation to mean something that's less sophisticated or perhaps simplistic. It sometimes even takes on the idea of animalistic, that it's not developed fully. We want to make sure when we talk about these traditions that we're talking about them as indigenous traditions. Indigenous means that it's something that occurs naturally in a certain place. When we talk about Native American traditions, for example, these are traditions that are tied to a particular place, which is North America, and they're civilizations and religious traditions that have risen out of the experience that the Native Americans have had in this location. They are not necessarily simplistic or unsophisticated. They simply are different from some of the other traditions that we see in the United States and around the world. Now, when we talk about Indigenous Native American religious traditions, we also will be making some generalizations. There are many indigenous tribes and varieties of religious experience. We will be talking about the Navajo quite a bit, but the Navajo are not the only tribe that we see in North America, and their religious experiences will not be exactly the same as the Cherokees, or the Choctaw, or the Inuits, for example. So, while we will be making some generalizations that can help us understand a bit more about Native American religious traditions as a whole, do note that these are not characteristics that are true of every experience of a Native American with their religious tradition. And the same will be true of the indigenous African religions we'll talk about later in the video. Just like we saw with ancient religious traditions, cosmogonies or creation stories are essential for understanding how adherents of a religious tradition view what their sacred is and what their place is in the world. Most Native American traditions view the Americas as the original place of creation. And while most Native Americans do not have written scriptures, they do have oral tradition that functions as a type of wisdom literature to teach proper living. We'll notice that the sacred for most Native Americans is not necessarily a deity. While there are some ideas of deities, gods, goddesses, and so on, we see an emphasis on the sacred or something greater than oneself, as the idea of simply nature or the earth. Native American religious traditions, including their stories and their rituals, which we'll see in a bit, are focused on connecting more fully with nature and with animals, plants, the sun, celestial bodies, and so on. Essentially, everything in the world is connected in some way. So, while nature has some kind of connection with humanity, we do want to make sure to understand that this is not necessarily animism. Some people will discuss Native American religious traditions, as well as some other indigenous traditions, and say that they're animistic. Animism means a belief that everything, whether animal, plant, human, or even inanimate objects, have a soul or spirit. Now, this is not to say that all Native American religious traditions do not have some aspect of animism. There may be some Native American religious traditions who do identify with this idea of animism, that everything, even inanimate objects, have souls or spirits. But as we look at Native American religious traditions as a whole, we simply want to understand that the focus of these individuals is on the connection of humans, animals, nature, etc., rather than simply understanding everything as having a soul or spirit. The way that we see Native American religious ideas carried out in the world is through rituals. A ritual is a set activity or series of practices, often involving art, music, dance, spoken word, religious texts, and so on, that typically serves a religious purpose or connects one to this sacred or ultimate reality. The Native Americans often do this through art. When you see artistic expression in Native American cultures, it typically has a larger purpose than simply just being pretty or artistically, aesthetically pleasing. For example, we'll talk about sand painting here in a moment, but we often see what we would consider art involved in Native American healing rituals. In Native American cultures, we often see what has come to be known as the medicine man. Now, medicine man is often seen as a derogatory term, but the idea here is that there's a person, whether a man or a woman, who is a healer. Now, while Native American cultures often don't like the use of the term medicine man or perhaps shaman, these are terms that you might hear in outside circles. There are various ways that Native Americans believe their healers can heal people in their communities. This often has to do with use of herbs. So again, we have this connection with the nature or natural as the sacred to heal people, as well as invoking spirits. One of the rituals we see is sand painting. You can see a picture here of a sand painting. And to us, it might seem artistically pleasing. But in Native American traditions, this is believed to be a way that a healer could heal somebody by having them sit in the middle of the circle and invoke the spirits and nature in a way that could heal them. Other rituals that we see in Native American traditions are rites of passage. We'll talk quite a bit about rites of passage in various religious traditions. And these are essentially rituals where somebody transitions from one part of life to the next. In Native American traditions, one of the most important that we see is the vision quest. The vision quest is typically a ritual carried out by usually an adolescent as they embark on this journey to realize themselves and connect with nature more. This vision quest is typically has a spirit guide and guides them through the spiritual world, often through fasting and separating themselves from the community as a whole. We also see Native American rituals in their music. If you listen to Native American music, you might notice a prominent heartbeat rhythm. We again see this connection between the Native Americans and the natural as the sacred, and the heartbeat mimics this, that everything has a heartbeat, whether human or animal, and that there's some connection between the humans, the animals, and nature itself. And we see this all tied together with the music and this musical rhythm of a heartbeat. As we turn our attention to African religious traditions, we want to note that we are talking about indigenous African traditions. These are ones that occurred naturally somewhere in the continent of Africa. Now, if you see the image here, you can see that these traditional African religions are not as prominent as they used to be. Islam is the dominant religion in the northern area of Africa, while Christianity is the dominant religion in most of southern Africa. Only on the island of Madagascar do we see this traditional African indigenous religion as the prominent religion. And this does not mean that everybody in, for example, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, etc., is Muslim. And this does not mean that everybody in Botswana, South Africa, Mozambique, etc. is Christian. What this means is that we see a lot more of these major religious traditions in these areas. So when we talk about these indigenous African religious traditions, a lot of them have been colored by Christianity or Islam. Just as we saw with Native American religious traditions, African religious traditions have a different sacred than we might see in some of the larger religious traditions. While for Native Americans the sacred is nature and the natural world, for most African religious traditions, the sacred is humanity or community. African religious traditions are typically focused on how to connect with each other, usually within the community. And they're typically anthropocentric. Anthropocentric literally means people-centered. Most African religious traditions are not focused on how to appease deities or how to connect with the natural world, but to see how the world can help them within the community and how they can connect to one another within their community. They typically understand gods as helping them because there's some kind of investment in humanity. Most African religious traditions are theistic. If you remember in the ancient religious traditions video, monotheistic means one god, polytheistic means many gods. African religious traditions are theistic. They have a belief in God or gods. This might vary from tribe to tribe and tradition to tradition. Many religious traditions in Africa have a focus on a one god, a high god, who is sometimes the only god, but sometimes is the chief god among other gods. This high god is often associated with natural elements like the earth or the sun. Many scholars believe that this is why traditions like Islam and Christianity that are monotheistic were able to stick in African regions where there was a belief in one high god, because the traditions have kind of merged over time. Just like we saw with Native American religious rituals, which were connected to the sacred that was nature, we see that African religious rituals are also focused on connecting to their sacred, which in this case is humanity or the community. We also see an emphasis on spirits or the spirit world. In Native American religious traditions, we typically see spirits as a variety of things, whether it's human spirits or animal spirits or any kind of natural element being a spirit. In African religious traditions, we typically see the idea of spirits as being human-like. Essentially, everybody comes from and departs to the spirit world. So for African religious rituals, there's often a connection with the spirits and an emphasis on seeking them out. This is often done through mediums or people whose goal it is to connect with the spirit world in some way and for some purpose, often for wisdom and guidance. We often see rites of passage in African religious traditions, and this is often connected to this idea of a spirit world. For many indigenous African religions, birth and death are rites of passage. People exist in the spirit world before they're born, so birth becomes a rite of passage as the spirit transitions into a physical form. whereas death is the transition of this physical form into the spirit world again. We see various ways that this is celebrated. In birth, you might see the pregnant mother shaving her head as a symbol of cutting the tie with the spirit child as they're born. We also will see the idea of sacrifice, whether it's animal sacrifice or simply plant sacrifice, etc., in many African indigenous religions, as there's a focus on appeasing the spirits to help out humanity. Just as we saw with the Native Americans, we also see music as an essential ritual in these African indigenous religions. However, whereas the Native Americans typically have a heartbeat rhythm that focuses on a connection with nature, we see in African religious traditions that music typically takes on a rhythmic quality that's consistent amongst the people in the community or tribe. Again, we see this idea that the community and humanity as a whole is the most important, is the sacred or ultimate reality for many of these indigenous African religions. Now that we have reached the end of this video, you should be able to define the following terms: animism, anthropocentric, and theistic. Explain the difference between indigenous and primitive. And describe indigenous, Native American, and African religious traditions and the rituals that demonstrate their belief systems.